Friends, hello there. Welcome to my kitchen and welcome to another edition in the teaching series. Hey, if you've been following along, you will know that we concluded our 7-part series on Zacchaeus last week. And this means that we are kind of in between series. So in a couple of weeks, I want to launch another series. But in these 2 weeks between Zacchaeus ending and the next series we're going to launch into, I want to look at a couple of stories around the life of Paul, or writings that Paul has done. Just recently got back from a trip to Turkey with an amazing group, and we just had such a phenomenal experience. So many people are scared about going to Turkey, and there is nothing to be scared of to go over there. I mean, we had the majority of our sites all to ourselves. The people in Turkey love us. They take amazing care of us. They love the fact that we are there and that there is some tourism in the country. And so we just had this tremendous trip. And so I'm kind of coming back on cloud 9 from that particular trip. And we will be releasing next year's Turkey trip date soon, so just stay tuned for that. I know a number of you have inquired about going next year, and a ton of you followed us on social media this year, so you kind of got a glimpse of what we were doing. But one of the things we do during the trip is we talk a lot about the Apostle Paul. All 3 of Paul's missionary journeys go through Turkey. Paul grew up in Turkey before he moved to Jerusalem, and there's just such a rich heritage of the biblical story that takes place in the land of Turkey. And so Paul is in Ephesus during his 3rd missionary journey, and he writes 1st and 2nd Corinthians to the followers of Jesus in Corinth, who are actually in Greece. It's about an hour drive from Athens. But there's a particular passage that we talk about on the trip, and it's a passage that has just been one of those passages that I think about often, and I think you'll enjoy learning a little bit more about it as well. And so it comes in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. But there's a whole context to it, and we're not going to jump into the larger context of what's going on. But Paul has basically just addressed the followers of Jesus, and he's addressing unique features of living into the Greco-Roman world and things they need to be aware of and all of this. And at the very end, he's talking about how he is seeking the good of others and not just the good of himself. And then in chapter 11, verse 1, this is what Paul writes. He says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." Now, the word follow here is the Greek word mimitai, and it comes from the word mimitates, which is where we get the word mimic from. And so Paul says, mimic my example as I mimic the example of Christ. The idea to mimic or to imitate. This is why other translations will say, imitate my example as I imitate Christ. And I love what Paul is doing in this passage, because he is saying, listen, we are all called to follow after Jesus. I mean, in fact, we see this in other places. 1 John 2:6 is a great example. John the disciple says, listen, if anybody claims to be in Christ, they must walk as Jesus walked. And the word walk there is the Greek word peripateo, which has its connection to the Hebrew as the word halak, which means to live or to go, but most emphatically to walk. And some of you will remember an earlier teaching series that we talked about the word halak. And it's also the foundation for walking the text, is that, we don't just want to look at the text and understand the text. We want to walk it out in our lives. And so as people who are followers of Jesus, this passage in John, 1 John 2:6, if anyone is in Christ, they must walk as Jesus walked, is that we want to follow the example of Jesus. We want to walk out his example in our lives in the world. But for many of us, we struggle to do so. And we go, well, what does it look like? I mean, if Jesus was walking in my shoes today, what would his walk look like? And how do I walk after him? And that's why this passage in 1 Corinthians 11 is so interesting, is that Paul says, mimic my example as I mimic Jesus. He's saying, if you want to understand what it is to walk after Jesus, to basically embody Jesus in your life today, if you're struggling to do that, just do what I do, because I'm mimicking Jesus. And Paul is setting himself up as an example of saying, listen, if you want to walk as Jesus walked, just mimic my life because I am mimicking Jesus. And friends, I think this just leads us to just a really interesting question, which is this. Can you say what Paul says? i.e., is your life worth mimicking? Because here's the reality, is that people are mimicking your life. It happens all the time. Human beings do this. And so if you're a mother, if you're a father, your kids are mimicking you. If you have any kind of influence at work or at school or on your sports team, like people are watching you. And if you're doing something well, like people are going to mimic you. And the question becomes is your life worth mimicking? There's this really great rabbi story that is told. This rabbi and his son are walking home one night, and they're walking through the village, and it's dark, and they see out of the corner of their eye another father and son, and they come stumbling out of the tavern, both of them, and they're just kind of fumbling down the alley. And the rabbi says to his son, as he looks across the way at this other father and son stumbling down the alley, and he says to his son, he goes, "Son, I envy that man because he has clearly passed along his values and lifestyle to his son." And he says, "My only hope is that father isn't more successful with his son than I am with you." See, this rabbi understood that how he chose to live his life, his son would adopt, his son would mimic what he does. Several years ago, many years ago, I guess now, my oldest, Denyon, is just about ready to turn 11. And I remember when he was 2 years old and we were back living in West Michigan, and we had just sold our little condo in Holland and we had bought a home. But there was a 6-week gap between when we left our condo and when we could get in to the home that we bought. And so we had to move into this little apartment on the northwest side of town. And so I remember one day just being in this little tiny bathroom, and I was shaving my face, and Denyon comes walking in. Again, he's about 2 years old, and he just kind of looks up at me with this perplexed look. You know, I've got white stuff all over my face. I probably had just shaved my head as well. And I looked down at him. I said, Daddy's shaving his face. And so I just showed him as I was shaving what I was doing. And I'm not sure if he'd actually ever seen me shave before. But he just kind of looks up at me, just kind of nods a little bit, and then, his little legs, he just kind of walks out of the bathroom. And I remember later on during the day, I was walking past the living room. And because we, only had 6 weeks, we just had a few of his toys that weren't boxed up. And one of them was this kitchenette set that was sitting in the corner of the living room. And I remember that as I was walking by, his back was to me. It was facing the kitchenette. It was sitting in a corner. And I remember just seeing him sitting there. And he had a plastic spoon from the set. And he's just sitting there. And he's going like this. And I remember just pausing in that moment and going, oh my goodness. This little guy is going to mimic everything I do. If he follows my example, is he actually going to be mimicking something that is going to be helpful to him? That, friends, our lives are impacting other people. And how we choose to live our life matters a great deal. And others are going to follow our lead. They're going to mimic what we do. And so the question again just becomes is our life worth mimicking? If someone was to follow us around over the next month and mimic how we treat one another, how we do what we do, the things we say, the jokes we tell, the way that we just engage people in life, if they mimicked everything that we do, would that be something that we would be proud of? Or is that something that we would go, oh no, I can't be passing this along to other people? So friends, there's a challenge for us today and for this week is just to think about, is our lives worth mimicking? Paul says, mimic me as I mimic Christ. We're all called, if you're a follower of Jesus, to mimic the life of Jesus in your life. And that as you get closer to Jesus, as you're able to mimic Jesus, that means that as others imitate you, that they're also imitating Christ as well. So friends, may you have a life that is worth mimicking. If you're finding things that are in your life that are just not helpful, this is where God goes, let's just address this for your good and for the good of others. So friends, thanks so much for stopping by. If you're engaging this anywhere other than at Walking the Text, feel free to head over there. I'll have a number of other questions for you to think through. And as always, if you just think that this is going to be a blessing or helpful to someone, share this with them, and may you walk out the text well in your life.